The rain came down in sheets, cold and sharp like glass. It moved across the Wyoming plains with the fury of a season turning mean, soaking the earth until the dust turned to ash-colored mud. Thunder murmured over the hills, and the sky hung low, swollen and unforgiving. She moved like a shadow behind the feed shed, barefoot, shaking, her dress clinging like a second skin soaked through. The hem dragged in the muck, torn in 3 places. Her arms were cut, her lips split. Mud caked her shins. A strand of wet hair stuck to her mouth as she bent over the barrel, hands trembling, scooping feed with the corner of her skirt. Each movement was desperate, rushed. She glanced toward the barn like a thief inside a church. The mule behind her was bones wrapped in skin, ribs like fingers pushing through a sack. It made no sound, just blinked slow in the rain, as if it, too, understood hunger. The door slammed. Her head jerked up. Through the rain, the boy stood framed in yellow light, holding a jug, shoulders swaying. Drunk again, hat crooked. His eyes landed on her like a whip cracking. "You filthy thief," he snarled, voice slurred but rising. She grabbed the edge of her skirt tighter, stepped back, her mouth opening but no words coming out. The boy stumbled off the porch. She ran. The mud pulled at her feet, slippery and thick. Her knees buckled once, then again. She hit the ground, palms sliding across gravel. Feed scattered. The sack of her skirt unfurled like a broken promise. "Rats like you belong in the ditch," the boy howled, throwing his boot. It hit her shoulder with a dull thud. She didn't look back. The wind howled down the gulch, swallowing her up as she slid into the darkness between 2 broken wagons. She crouched behind one, arms wrapped around her middle, sobbing into her knees. Her whole body trembled, teeth clacking. She smelled of mildew, rot, and blood. Somewhere far off, the mule brayed once and then fell silent. He saw it all. Luke Calder stood still, one boot in the mud, the other on a fence rail. A wool coat hung off his frame, like it had forgotten its shape. The brim of his hat funneled rain down his back, and his rifle stayed strapped, untouched, slung over his shoulder. He didn't move as she disappeared, just stared through the dark. His limp made stillness feel easier than walking. The ache in his leg was sharp tonight, but dull compared to the one in his chest. He'd seen faces like hers before, on the battlefield, in the camps, behind prison bars. He knew what it meant to shake without crying. He knew hunger like a second name, but he didn't call out, didn't move, didn't stop her fall. Night fell thick. The land sank into silence. Somewhere coyotes whined, and the wind beat against canvas like a cruel drum. Luke sat under his tarp behind the bunkhouse, a tin cup of coffee cold in his hand. He lit his pipe with fingers calloused and cracked, the flare of the match briefly lighting the worn lines on his face. 40 maybe. Younger if he smiled, but he didn't. Not often. Not anymore. Smoke curled into the rain. He watched it disappear. He thought of her. Not her name. He didn't know it. Just her silhouette, crouched behind that wagon, hands bleeding. She hadn't begged, hadn't spoken. She just stole enough to survive and looked more afraid of being seen than being punished. That meant something. He remembered a town in Virginia, 10 years back. A girl with a baby swaddled in rags. He gave her a coat. It was all he had. That baby would be grown now, if it had lived. He never knew. He closed his eyes. The war had taken everything but memory. He should have gone after her. But he didn't. Not yet. Out in the dark, past the bunkhouse and the dying mule, she lay curled against rusted iron, the rain pattering on her back like cruel fingers. Her skin felt like fire and ice all at once. The bruises on her arms bloomed darker in the cold. She thought of food, not taste, just warmth. She thought of a name once whispered into her ear as she drifted off to sleep. She tried to say it now, but her lips wouldn't move. She dreamed of fire, not a warm one, but one that swallowed a house and took a child with it. A single tear broke loose and disappeared into the rain. By dawn, the storm had thinned to a drizzle, and the valley lay hushed under gray. A rooster called from a mile off, broken and hoarse. Luke woke early. He always did. Sleep came in slivers. He saddled his horse slow, fed it oats with a steady hand. Then he packed a small tin of beans in his coat and set off toward the gulch, not saying where he was going, and not being asked. She didn't see him come. She saw the tin, placed quietly on the ledge beside the wagon. Steam rose faint from the cracks. A sliver of cornbread wrapped in cloth beside it. No footsteps near it. Just the food, warm and untouched. She looked around. Nothing but fog and field. She didn't smile. But her hands didn't shake quite as much when she reached for the bread. Luke didn't watch her eat. He didn't want thanks. He just went back to his chores, his pipe, his silence. But the next night, he brought a blanket. And the next, dry boots. He never said a word. He watched from a distance. How she folded the blanket like it was silk. How she warmed her hands before touching food. How she never stayed in the same place twice. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. Still, he began to remember her face more than he meant to. One evening, when the rain had finally left, and only the smell of wetwood lingered, Luke found her on the steps of the old church, curled in sleep. Her face was pale, jaw clenched even in rest. The bruise on her cheek had turned yellow. He stood for a long time. Then he shrugged off his coat and laid it over her shoulders. She stirred. He didn't step back. She looked up at him with eyes that weren't afraid, just tired. "You're safe here now," he said softly. Then he walked away before she could speak. Behind him, under the coat, her hands came up to her face, and for the first time since she'd fallen into this world of dust and men, she wept without shame. The sun never quite rose that morning. It crawled over the plains like an apology, weak and gray, casting the world in a cold haze that clung to bone. Beneath the splintered wreck of a collapsed wagon, Emmeline lay curled on her side, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together. Her skin had taken on a bluish hue, mottled like bruised fruit, and her dress was stiff from dried blood at the hip. A dog, mangy and half-wild, circled nearby, growling low. She didn't flinch. She didn't have the strength. She pressed her palm to her side, where fever burned through her ribs like kindling. Her breath came ragged, shallow. Around her, the valley held its silence, broken only by the steady panting of the dog and the crows wheeling above. Hoofbeats came slow. Luke saw her before she saw him, barely a shape beneath the collapsed boards, a ghost of a girl hiding in wood and shadow. He slowed his horse, dismounted. For a moment, he stood there, rain-damp coat hanging heavy, watching. The dog bared its teeth. He didn't flinch. He knelt, pulled a dented tin of beans from his saddlebag, and placed it in the grass. No words, no gestures, just a pause, long enough for her to know it was from him. And then he mounted again and rode off into the mist. She waited until his shape vanished into the trees, before crawling forward and dragging the tin to her chest. It was still warm. The days passed like smoke. He didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it. But each morning, something new appeared by the wagon's edge, sometimes a heel of bread, sometimes a folded blanket that smelled faintly of tobacco and saddle oil. Once, a bar of soap wrapped in cloth. Another day, dry boots, laces coiled neatly inside. She touched each gift like it might vanish, then clutched it to her chest like it wouldn't. She never said thank you, not once, but her eyes, sharp and watchful, followed him whenever he passed. Not longing, not fear, just a quiet, wary hunger, for kindness, maybe, or for proof that it might not be a trick. He kept his distance, spoke to no one about her, just did his work, mending fences, breaking in a new mule, splitting wood till his back ached. Some nights he'd sit beneath the cottonwood with his pipe, smoke curling up toward the stars, and think about the way her shoulders still hunched even when the sun was warm, about the tremble in her hands when she reached for bread. It was near midnight when the storm hit again. Lightning cracked across the hills. The wind howled through the valley like it remembered war. Luke pulled on his coat and made for the barn to check the animals, but something stopped him. A sound, barely audible over the wind. A cough, maybe, or a sob. He turned toward the chapel. She was there, curled on the stone steps, arms wrapped tight around herself, head buried in her knees. Rain pelted her like gravel. She didn't move when he approached. Her eyes were open but distant, somewhere far off, like she was floating downriver and hadn't decided yet whether to fight the current. He knelt beside her, shoulders dripping. Slowly, deliberately, he unfastened his duster and draped it over her. The weight of it made her flinch at first, but then she stilled. He let his hand rest lightly on her back. "You're safe here now," he said. That was all. He stood, stepped back into the dark, and left her to the night. She didn't sleep. Not really. She just sat beneath the coat and breathed, her fingers tracing the seams of the sleeves like she was trying to learn something by touch alone. The next morning, she walked to the stream behind the church and scrubbed her skin raw with the soap he'd given. She combed her fingers through her hair until it stopped snarling. The bruises were still there, but they didn't seem to define her face anymore. Luke saw her walking past the corral later that day. She didn't look at him, but she paused near the fence and ran her hand along the back of the old mule. Just once. Then she kept walking. In the days that followed, something shifted. He brought her to the barn one morning, pointed at a saddle strap, and placed the tools in her hand. She didn't say a word, just watched his movements, mimicked them. She had quick fingers, clever ones, like she'd done this before in some other life. Another day, he showed her how to clean a horse's hoof. She flinched when the animal stamped, but held firm. Dirt fell away with each scrape. A job done right, slow and steady. When she returned to her wagon that evening, a single wildflower rested on the wheel's edge. Purple petals, fragile and still glistening with dew. She didn't touch it right away. Just sat beside it, eyes down, as if she didn't want to break the spell by acknowledging it. Later, she tucked it into the seam of his duster, where he hung it on a fence post. He found it, said nothing. On a warm afternoon, she passed by the bunkhouse, arms full of chopped wood. The foreman spat near her feet. "Careful, girl. Snake like you might get stepped on." She froze. Luke was there before she could answer, stepping between them like he'd been waiting all day. He didn't speak, just stared. His silence was sharp enough to bleed. The foreman looked away, muttered something about chores, and left. She didn't thank him, just nodded barely and went on. At night, she'd sit by the fire pit, alone but not far from where he worked. He'd glance up, and she'd look away, but neither of them left. Their silences had begun to say more than words. Sometimes she'd hear a baby cry from a cabin up the hill, and her hands would still. Once, she wandered toward the sound, drawn like a ghost, stood just outside the window and watched. A mother, a crib, a lullaby whispered over warm blankets. Emmeline turned away before the tears could fall. She remembered the preacher's wagon, the way the hymns would mask the screaming. She remembered the hollow ache of leaving behind something too small to carry and too fragile to survive. But she buried those memories deep, too deep for speech. Only her eyes betrayed her when Luke glanced her way. One evening, she brought him a mug of coffee she'd boiled herself over the fire. She placed it down and stepped back before he could speak. He looked up, surprised, but didn't move to stop her. Just raised the cup and sipped. It tasted like rain and ash, like memory, like the start of something unnamed. Neither of them smiled, but something inside them began to thaw. One bite at a time. The whispers started small, like the wind brushing dry grass, soft and spiteful. "She's the one what stole from us," one of the ranch hands muttered behind a dirty palm as he spat tobacco juice into the dust. The others nodded, quiet at first, but the glances grew longer, the silence heavier, and by the end of the week, the talk had turned to laughter, the kind that stuck to your back, like a knife you couldn't see. Emmeline felt it, the way footsteps slowed when she passed, how voices dropped and eyes lingered, just long enough to make her gut twist. She kept her head down, moved around the edges of things, always near fences, shadows, water troughs, never too near a crowd. But the ranch wasn't endless, and the hate had a way of circling back. It was just past dusk when she went to fetch water. The sky was bruised purple, the last lights sinking behind the ridge. She didn't see them until it was too late. Two of Gollinger's boys, half drunk and ugly with it. One had a bottle swinging from his fingers, the other a rope coiled over his shoulder. "Well, look who got herself new boots," the tall one slurred, stepping from behind the feed crates. She froze. The bucket slipped from her grip and thudded into the dirt. "You think you're someone now?" the other sneered, stumbling forward. "Walking around here like you belong? Like a man didn't just take pity on you." Emmeline took a step back. "Don't," she said softly. He grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanked her forward. She gasped, stumbled, caught herself on his chest. The bottle clinked to the ground, forgotten. "We could remind you what you are." She didn't scream, just twisted, hands clawing at his wrist, breath short with panic. Then a voice cut the dark like a blade. "That's far enough." Luke's shadow stepped out from between the trees, slow and deliberate. The rifle was in his hand, then lowered, set down in the dirt like a final word. He didn't need it. "You touch her again," he said, voice low and solid as stone, "and I'll make sure you drink through a straw the rest of your life." The tall one's grin faltered. The other released her, too quickly. "Hell, we were just talking. You were laying hands." They didn't argue further. The look in Luke's eyes wasn't the kind that gave room for answers. The kind that came back from war with things buried deep and cold. The kind that had already decided what bones to break. They backed off into the dark, muttering curses and kicking dust. One of them tripped over the bucket, and Emmeline flinched at the sound. Luke stepped forward, offering her nothing, no hand, no words, just his presence. She didn't need more. But the quiet didn't last. By morning, the whole ranch buzzed with it. Foreman caught Luke near the stables, a scowl carved deep into his jaw. "You bring your trouble to my men now," he snapped. Luke said nothing. "She ain't worth a damn bedroll, and you're ready to spill blood over her?" Still he stayed silent. The foreman spat near his boots. "We don't need your kind here. Defending whores." Luke looked up at that, eyes flat, unreadable. Then he leaned forward and spat back, clean, sharp, dead center of the foreman's chest. Didn't wait for a reply. He walked away with nothing but his saddle, his coat, and a handful of tools tied in canvas. Didn't look back at the barn or the men, not even when they shouted behind him. She watched him from the edge of the corral, standing barefoot in the straw, arms wrapped around herself. As he passed, she followed, not close enough to walk beside him, but not far enough to be forgotten. The wind picked up as they crested the hill, the ranch shrinking behind them into memory. The trees ahead whispered in low voices, and the air smelled of pine and the promise of rain. They camped by a creek that night, under a wide sky scratched with stars. He built a fire without asking for help, just like always. She didn't sit near it, not at first. Just watched the flames from the other side, her arms still folded like a shield. But when the fire crackled into something steady, she stepped forward and sat across from him, knees pulled to her chest. Her face was smeared with dust and wind, her hair tangled and wild. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. Luke stirred the fire with a stick, not looking up. "You don't owe me nothing." He looked across at her then, and the light caught the lines in his face. Deep ones, the kind carved by years, by grief, by silence, worn like a coat. "You didn't steal feed," he said, voice quiet as the creek beside them. "You stole my quiet." Her mouth opened, closed. A breath caught somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You saying that like it's a good thing." He shrugged. Was too quiet anyhow. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Just the fire popping, the water running slow over stone, the far-off cry of some night bird circling. She reached down and rubbed her thumb against her palm, a nervous motion, then looked up. "I used to think I'd die in a ditch," she whispered, "like a dog, or a coyote folks put down and don't bother burying." "You didn't." "No," she said, "I didn't." The firelight danced between them. She leaned forward slightly, hands near the warmth, and for the first time, her shoulders didn't hunch, didn't flinch at every shift of the wind. Luke pulled his coat tighter and laid back in the grass, staring up at the stars. "Reckon you'll have to find something else to do now," he murmured, "since dying ain't on the docket." She smiled, faint and fragile. It flickered like the flame between them, small but stubborn. "Reckon I might," she said. And for a while, they just sat, two shapes carved from dust and firelight, the hurt between them not healed but quieted, held, not hidden. Neither asked what tomorrow held. Neither needed to. The trail to Dry Hollow was long and open, carved through a valley that looked like God had dragged his knuckles across the earth. Dust kicked up behind them as they rode side by side, saying little. Their horses walked slow, like they sensed something was changing in the air. The silence between Luke and Emmeline had become familiar, not heavy like before, but steady, like a song both of them knew the rhythm to without needing the words. He carried his saddle tools and a small sack of coffee. She had a rag-wrapped bundle of her own, needles, thread, a chipped comb, a tin spoon. What little they owned, they carried. What they didn't, they'd earn. Dry Hollow wasn't much. A post office, a church, a general store with more dust than supplies. There was a boarding house on the edge of town, with a warped front porch and chickens that came and went like they owned the place. Luke got work breaking horses out back of the livery. Emmeline scrubbed floors in the church and laundered sheets at the boarding house. At night, she washed her hands until the water turned gray and her knuckles cracked. Luke didn't ask about the blisters. She didn't mention the limp in his leg when he walked home late. They never talked about what they were to each other. There were no promises, no declarations, but they sat together on the porch each evening, and sometimes she fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, and sometimes he stayed awake just to keep her there a little longer. Word spread of a land draw to the east, 20-acre plots for men who could claim kin or stake a future. Folks started lining up. Some brought papers. Some brought lies. Most brought hope. Town hall was packed tight that morning. Sweat and dust and Sunday coats filled the air. The marshal stood at the front with a list and a voice that didn't care who you were, only if your name matched the paper in his hand. Next name. Luke called her. Luke stepped forward. The room quieted. He'd never spoken much to anyone, never joined in on whiskey nights or Sunday hymns. Still, folks knew his face, knew the limp, the scar near his jaw, the way he kept to himself and watched everything. Next of kin, the marshal asked. There was a pause, long enough for the room to shift. Luke cleared his throat. Her name's Emmeline Calder now. Gasps. A soft intake of breath from somewhere near the back. A woman near the window clutched at her pearls. A man muttered, "Ain't married, far as I know." But Luke didn't wait. He turned, walked out the doors, and let the wooden floor creak behind him. Emmeline stood under the awning, her hands clenched around her apron. Her eyes found him the moment he stepped into the sunlight. She didn't speak, not right away. Just moved toward him like her feet already knew the path. She caught his coat sleeve. "You gave me a name," she whispered. He stopped, looked down at her, at the worry in her brow, the way her lips trembled just slightly. "You gave me a reason," he said. She let go of his coat and held his hand instead. They got the land. A small stretch of dry soil with a crooked fence, a leaning barn, and a field that hadn't seen green in too long. But it was theirs. Together, they built it up, day by day, fence post by fence post. He taught her how to drive nails without splitting the wood. She showed him how to mend shirts with thread no thicker than grass. There were mornings when they rose before the sun, and evenings when they fell asleep still wearing their boots. But there was laughter too, small and rare at first, like spring rain, but growing stronger with time. One day, she found a hen had laid 4 eggs in her apron. She carried them to him like they were made of gold. He didn't say much, just smiled that crooked, tired smile of his, and built a nest box out of scrap wood by nightfall. They didn't talk about love. It was something that lived in the doing, not the saying. In the way he poured the last of the coffee into her cup. In the way she waited until he was asleep before covering him with the extra blanket. Then the rain returned. It came slow at first, then steady, soaking into the dirt like forgiveness. The sky opened, and the valley softened. The air smelled of wet earth, and something new. She stood by the fence that evening, one hand resting on the worn rail. Chickens scratched at the mud nearby. The old mule stood under the awning of the barn, blinking at the sky like it couldn't quite believe its luck. Her hair was damp, curling against her cheeks. She wore the dress she'd patched a dozen times. Her boots were worn but dry. Her eyes wandered over the land as though she were still trying to believe it was real. Luke came up behind her, quiet as ever. He held his hat in one hand, looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he placed the hat gently on her head. She turned. He kissed her forehead. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain, of wood smoke, of wheat and wildflowers waiting to bloom. The sky darkened with clouds, but neither of them moved. Out here, the storms don't ask your name. But if someone gives you one, you hold it like fire in the cold.